A Soviet submarine sits submerged off the coast of Cuba, cut off from Moscow, running out of air, and getting depth-charged by American destroyers who think they're just trying to scare it to the surface. The crew doesn't know that. They think the war has already started. 3 officers on board have the authority to launch a nuclear torpedo. 2 of them vote yes. 1 doesn't. His name is Vasily Arkhipov, and his no is the only reason you're watching this video instead of reading about it in a bunker. History loves to pretend it was inevitable. It wasn't. Most of the biggest turns in human history came down to a single decision, a single delay, a single person in the right place who could have just as easily been somewhere else. So today we're counting down 10 real moments where history almost broke differently and what the world might have looked like if it had. Let's get into it. Number 10. Georg Elser and the 13 minutes that could have ended the war before it really started. In November of 1939, a German carpenter named Georg Elser spent over a month hollowing out a pillar inside Munich's Burger Bräukeller, the beer hall where Hitler gave a speech every single year to mark the anniversary of his failed 1923 putsch. He wasn't part of any resistance network, no British intelligence backing, no army conspiracy behind him. Just one man, working alone at night after the bar closed, quietly carving out a cavity for explosives over more than 30 separate nights. Elser packed that pillar with a timed bomb, planning for it to go off while Hitler was mid-speech, surrounded by the Nazi leadership, close enough to take out a huge chunk of the regime in one blast. Hitler, for reasons that still aren't fully agreed on, cut his speech short and left early. 13 minutes after he walked out the door, the bomb detonated, killing 8 people who'd stayed behind for a drink. Historians still argue about why he left when he did. Fog grounding his planned flight back to Berlin, wanting to catch a train instead, plain restlessness. Whatever the reason, a single carpenter working almost entirely alone came within a quarter of an hour of changing the entire trajectory of the war, before France had even fallen. Elser was captured trying to cross into Switzerland the same night, and spent years in custody before the Nazis executed him just weeks before the war ended. Number 9. The 5 minutes at Midway. By June of 1942, Japan's carrier fleet had been steamrolling the Pacific for 6 straight months without a real defeat. At Midway, American codebreakers had cracked just enough of Japan's naval codes to know roughly where and when the attack was coming, but knowing that didn't guarantee anything. Earlier waves of American torpedo bombers had already been slaughtered attacking the Japanese carriers directly. Nearly every single plane in one squadron shot down for basically nothing. But those doomed attacks pulled Japan's fighter cover down low to deal with them, right as Japanese carriers were mid-swap, switching their planes from bombs meant for the island back to torpedoes meant for ships, leaving the decks packed with fuel lines and armed bombs stacked in the open. That's the exact window American dive bombers happened to arrive in, completely unopposed at altitude because the fighters were still down low. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed in minutes. Show up 20 minutes earlier, before the decks are that exposed, or 20 minutes later, after the next wave of fighters climbs back up, and you're probably watching American planes get shredded instead. Some historians will tell you Japan was doomed either way, given the industrial gap between the 2 countries. Maybe, eventually. But the few minutes on either side of that one attack were doing an awful lot of the work in the meantime. Number 8. The fog over Brooklyn. Late August 1776. George Washington's entire Continental Army, the only real fighting force the rebellion has, is trapped on Long Island, backs to the East River, British warships in the harbor, and tens of thousands of British and Hessian troops closing in on land. This is, by most reasonable accounts, the moment the American Revolution should have ended, less than 2 months after independence was even declared. Instead, Washington quietly organizes an overnight evacuation, commandeering every small boat he can find. A dense fog rolls in, right as dawn approaches, thick enough that Washington manages to ferry roughly 9,000 men, plus horses, cannon, and supplies, across the river to Manhattan without the British noticing until the operation is basically finished. By the time the fog lifts, the Continental Army is simply gone. No fog, and there's a real argument that the war ends in 1776, in a rout, with Washington either dead or captured, and the rebellion crushed in its first real campaign. Number 7. Hitler's halt order at Dunkirk. In 1940, with the British Expeditionary Force pinned against the French coast and German tanks close enough to finish the job, Hitler ordered his armor to stop. The reasons are still debated. Worry about tank losses, Göring wanting the Luftwaffe to get the credit, general caution after a fast advance. Whatever the mix, that pause bought just enough time for Britain to evacuate over 300,000 soldiers across the Channel. Those soldiers became the core of the army that would go on to fight through North Africa and eventually back into Europe. No halt order, and Britain is fighting the rest of the war without the men it needed most. Number 6. Fanny Kaplan and the bullets that didn't finish the job. In August of 1918, a revolutionary named Fanny Kaplan shot Vladimir Lenin 3 times outside a Moscow factory. He survived, badly wounded, 1 bullet lodged near his lung for the rest of his life. Had those shots landed differently, the Bolshevik state, barely a year old and still fighting a civil war, loses its founder before it's even consolidated power. Whether Trotsky, Stalin, or nobody at all manages to hold that coalition together afterward is genuinely an open question, and everything downstream of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the entire shape of the 20th century, is riding on 3 shots from a woman with famously bad eyesight. Number 5. The rain before Waterloo. Napoleon's final defeat in 1815 is often talked about like it was destiny, but the battle almost didn't happen the way it did. Heavy overnight rain turned the ground to mud, and Napoleon delayed his attack by several hours to let the ground firm up enough for his artillery to maneuver. Those hours gave the Prussian army under Blücher just enough extra time to arrive and reinforce Wellington's exhausted line. Attack a few hours earlier, before the Prussians show up, and a lot of historians think Napoleon wins that day. Instead, wet ground bought the coalition the hours it needed to end his career for good. Number 4. Stanislav Petrov and the alarm that wasn't real. September 1983. A Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov is on duty at a nuclear early warning center when the system reports an incoming American missile launch, then several more. Soviet doctrine at the time called for immediate retaliation. Petrov had minutes to decide, and he decided the alarm was probably a malfunction, and reported it as one. He was right. A satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for a missile launch. Petrov wasn't rewarded for this. He was quietly reprimanded for paperwork issues, and mostly forgotten until decades later, when the story became public. One man, alone, at the edge of the Cold War's most dangerous decade, deciding not to trust the machine. Number 3. The night Berlin's wall fell by accident. In November of 1989, an East German official named Günter Schabowski was handed a note about slightly loosened travel restrictions, set to take effect the next day, with proper coordination. At a press conference, someone asked him when the new rules would start. He hadn't been fully briefed, glanced at the note and said, as far as he knew, immediately. East Germans watching the broadcast took that literally and started showing up at checkpoints that same night. In numbers, the guards weren't prepared to hold back with the orders they had. The wall didn't fall because of a summit or a treaty. It fell because one tired bureaucrat improvised an answer to a question he wasn't ready for. Number 2. Reagan, a hospital, and half an inch. In March of 1981, John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots at Ronald Reagan outside a Washington hotel. 1 bullet ricocheted off the presidential limousine and lodged less than an inch from Reagan's heart. He was in surgery within the hour and, remarkably, back at work in under a month. Doctors afterward were fairly direct about how close it actually was. A slightly different angle, a slightly slower ambulance, and the American presidency changes hands less than 3 months into a term that would go on to reshape the Cold War's final act. Number 1. The wrong turn in Sarajevo. This one might be the single most famous, almost in modern history, mostly because it isn't really an almost at all. It's the moment everything actually tipped, which makes it worth slowing down on. In June of 1914, a group of young Bosnian Serb conspirators lined the motorcade route through Sarajevo, planning to kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand as he toured the city. The first attempt that morning failed outright. A bomb bounced off the Archduke's car and injured people in the vehicle behind it instead. Most of the remaining conspirators scattered, assuming the plot was blown. One of them, Gavrilo Princip, didn't go far. He ended up near a corner deli, having basically given up on the day going anywhere. Later that afternoon, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded from the morning's bombing, and his driver, working from an outdated route, took a wrong turn onto a side street. Told he'd made a mistake, the driver stopped the car to reverse, and the car stalled directly in front of that same deli. Princip stepped off the curb and fired twice at point-blank range. A wrong turn, a stalled engine, and a conspirator who happened to still be standing on the right corner, stacked on top of an already failed plot from earlier that same morning. 4 years later, 10 million people are dead, and 3 empires no longer exist. So what do you do with all that? Honestly, not much, other than sit with how thin the line actually is. We like to tell history as a story with momentum. Empires that were destined to fall, wars that were always going to happen, leaders who were always going to win. But zoom in close enough on almost any turning point, and you find a submarine officer, a tired bureaucrat, some fog, some rain, a wrong turn down the wrong street, deciding it for everyone else. Somewhere out there in the timelines that didn't happen, there's a version of this video counting down the 10 times history almost went back to normal instead.